So I assume most of you are probably in North America somewhere. So good morning to you all. And I see some people also from India and the East. So good evening to you as well. So I'm going to start with the Samyutta Nikaya. This is called Anuradha. So this is an interesting sutta because this sutta is really related to different kinds of viewpoints, and specifically with regards to viewpoints related to the self. So what we're talking about really is the one of the first three fetters, which is the Sakaya Ditti, which means the belief in a personality or the belief in a personal sense of self that is independent and permanent. And there are different viewpoints related to that and related to the world, the universe, and then sometimes it's referred to as whether the Tathagat exists or doesn't exist, or he both exists and doesn't exist, or whether he doesn't exist, does exist nor does not exist. So there's this tetralemma, they call it. So we're going to be talking about that. We'll be discussing that through this sutta. And he uses the term Tathagat, but as you'll see in the sutta, Tathagat is just another name for the Buddha, but it's not in reference to anything or anyone that is a permanent self. So you could replace the word Tathagat with self, or with the Arahat, or with the world, or whatever it might be. But specifically here, for the purposes of understanding the fetter of self-view, of personality belief, we'll be looking at it from that context. There are different ways of understanding the different types of self-view. In the Abhidhamma, there are about 20 different types of self-view, which you can still find in the suttas like this one, as well as in the Chula Vedala. They have a little bit of a difference. We can discuss that later, but for the most part, they're pretty much the same in terms of the kinds of views related to the self and in regards to the five aggregates. So with that sort of an introduction, let me start with reading, and then I'll give you the explanation as we continue. On one occasion, the Blessed One was dwelling at Vesali in the great wood in the hall with the peaked roof. Now, on that occasion, the Venerable Anuradha was dwelling in a forest hut not far from the Blessed One. So this is Anuradha, not to be mistaken with Anuruddha. Anuruddha was one of the prime arahats and disciples of the Buddha, and he was known for his clairvoyance, his ability to see into different realms of existence and read into people's minds and things like that. In fact, during the Buddha's parinibbana, he was able to discern with that clairvoyance whether the Buddha had passed into parinibbana or not, and actually was able to record the Buddha going through each of the jhanas in the forward direction and then in the reverse direction, and then finally going into the fourth jhana and then taking parinibbana as his object, and then the dissolution of the five aggregates. So here, this is a different person altogether, and his name is Anuradha. So it says, then a number of wanderers of other sects approached the Venerable Anuradha and exchanged greetings with him. When they had concluded their greetings and cordial talk, they sat down to one side and said to him, Friend Anuradha, when a Tathagat is describing a Tathagat, the highest type of person, the supreme person, the attainer of the supreme attainment, here they've already made the mistake of assuming Tathagat as a person, which is not the case, as you'll see. He describes him in terms of these four cases. The Tathagat exists after death, or the Tathagat does not exist after death, or the Tathagat both exists and does not exist after death, or the Tathagat neither exists nor does not exist. So this is the tetralemma that we were talking about. So here the Tathagat exists after death. That is a eternalist view, the idea that there is a life beyond death that is the same sense of self. It is a soul that continues on after death. The Tathagat does not exist after death is the view of annihilationism, which is to say that the self is equated with the body. And so when the body is dissolved at the point of death, so is the self. The Tathagat both exists and does not exist after death. So this is, according to the notes, the commentary in this, it's regarding a syncretic view, which is trying to basically appease both viewpoints in saying that it is a type of eternalism. Or the Tathagat neither exists nor does not exist after death. And this is more of a skeptical view. This is in ancient India, there was an entire group of people known as the Anyana, and that's really the skeptics, the Indian logical skeptics. And they were also known as evasive skeptics, and sometimes known as eel wrigglers in the suttas because of their inability to really stand to one point and really, have some kind of a view that they talked about or professed. When this was said, the Venerable Anuradha said to the wanderers, "Friends, when the Tathagat is describing a Tathagat, the highest type of person, the supreme person, the attainer of the supreme attainment, he describes him apart from these four cases. The Tathagat exists after death, or the Tathagat does not exist after death, or the Tathagat both exists and does not exist after death, or the Tathagat neither exists nor does not exist." So here Anuradha is trying to explain to them that none of these point to a sense of self, and none of these are valid in terms of trying to examine the nature of a Tathagat or examine the nature of a self. And he's saying there's a view apart from this. He says that the way to describe him is apart from these four cases. But that is only partially right, assuming that Anuradha is talking about a fifth case. But we'll see that that fifth case is something different entirely towards the end. When this was said, those wanderers said to the Venerable Anuradha, "This bhikkhu must be newly ordained, not long gone forth. Or if he is an elder, he must be an incompetent fool." So the wanderers of these different sects were obviously considering Anuradha to be a monk who had just newly been ordained. And so they assumed that he didn't know what he was talking about completely, and that surely the Buddha must have one of these viewpoints in his philosophy and in his Dhamma. Then those wanderers of other sects, having denigrated the Venerable Anuradha with the terms newly ordained and fool, rose from their seats and departed. But obviously the views that they had were inconsistent with the Dhamma, with the Buddha's dispensation. So their assumptions were based on what they knew and understood as reality, but was still under the conditional lens of reality. Then not long after those wanderers had left, it occurred to the Venerable Anuradha, "If those wanderers of other sects should question me further, how should I answer if I am to state what has been said by the Blessed One and not misrepresent him with what is contrary to fact? And how should I explain in accordance with the Dhamma, so that no reasonable consequence of my assertion would give ground for criticism?" So he has a very valid line of thought. He wants to know what would be the best way to respond to questions like this. And so he goes to the Buddha. Then the Venerable Anuradha approached the Blessed One, paid homage to him, sat down to one side, and reported to the Blessed One everything that had happened, asking, "If those wanderers of other sects should question me further, how should I answer, so that no reasonable consequence of my assertion would give ground for criticism?" And now the Buddha responds. He says, "What do you think, Anuradha? Is form permanent or impermanent?" "Impermanent, Venerable Sir." So form is impermanent. You see, we always see this in some of the suttas regarding the five aggregates as being impermanent or permanent. But what does that mean exactly in terms of form, feeling, perception, formations, and consciousness? Impermanence is really the understanding of anicca. And anicca means something that is not permanent, something that is transient and always in flux, something that is always changing, changing due to external causes and conditions, or even internal causes and conditions, like in the case of the body. The body continues to age, even though we don't really recognize it. But if you look at it, we were born as infants and, went through the stage of toddlers, went through the stage of childhood and adolescence and adulthood. And eventually we will all grow old, and eventually the body will deteriorate and decay after death. So the form that we see, whether it's our own body or form in relation to anything else, because there is another questionnaire that the Buddha puts forward in regards to form, which is form near and far, past, future, or present. So he talks about form in relation to not just this body, but all forms. Whether you're talking about the earth itself, the planet itself, rocks, whether you're talking about the form of animals and other beings, whether you're talking about the form of stars and so on. Everything decays, everything deteriorates, everything is in a state of flux. So he says it's impermanent. And so he says, therefore, seeing thus, he understands there is no more for this state of being. So this has been an abbreviated version, but the full version of that, what he's talking about is, if form, feeling, perception, formations, and consciousness, if those are impermanent, would one consider them to be a source of happiness? Because a source of happiness would be something that is unending, something that doesn't deteriorate, something that doesn't decay, something that continues on and gives you, satisfying happiness that continues to satisfy no matter the circumstances. So in this case, the form, feeling, perception, formations, and consciousness, Anuradha describes as being suffering, not happiness, not a cause for happiness, because they are impermanent. So then the Buddha says, if what is impermanent and suffering, should it be right to call that as myself, me, mine, and myself? Should it be considered to be a self? Should it be considered to be my essence, my independent, permanent sense of self? And it cannot be, because if what is impermanent is supposedly, going to be decayed, then that can't be considered to be a permanent self. If something that is a cause for suffering should be considered to be self, that would be inaccurate, because a self always is looking for happiness for itself. The self is independent. But the five aggregates are arisen because of causes and conditions. So any self attached to that would be impersonal, would be impermanent, and would not be considered to be independent. Excuse me. So he goes through this questionnaire with the five aggregates, and then he finally says, knowing so that these five aggregates are impersonal, are impermanent, and not worth holding on to, one lets go of the clinging to those five aggregates. Having not clung to, their mind does not become agitated. Their mind becoming not agitated becomes peaceful, knowing reality as it is. And so there is that hallmark statement, which is that birth is destroyed. What had to be done has been done. The spiritual life has been completed, and there is no more for this state of being. So the Buddha goes through this as one aspect where he says all 5 aggregates now we understand as impermanent. We understand as a cause for suffering, and we understand as impersonal. Now that we have this foundation, let's look at the next part of the questionnaire. He says, what do you think, Anuradha? Do you regard, excuse me, excuse me. What do you think, Anuradha? Do you regard form as the Tathagata? No, Venerable Sir. Do you regard feeling, perception, formations, consciousness as the Tathagata? No, Venerable Sir. So here is the first set of views. In this case, we will consider the Tathagata as self. So he says, do you regard self as form or feeling, perception, formations, or consciousness? So that's equating the self as one of these 5 aggregates. And that cannot be the case, as we already know that each of the 5 aggregates are impermanent and suffering and not self. So these first this set of 5 views has been understood as invalid. It cannot be self. So then he says, what do you think, Anuradha? Do you regard the Tathagata or the self as in form? No, Venerable Sir. Do you regard, so now he's talking about the self as in form, meaning that there is a sense of self within form. There is a sense of self within feeling. There is a sense of self within perception. There is a sense of self within formations or consciousness. So the first set of views was self as the 5 aggregates, which would be invalid. Now, if the 5 aggregates, as we understand them, are impermanent, suffering, and not self, you can't say that the self is within any of the 5 aggregates either, because they are inherently impermanent. So that's the second set of views. So then he says, do you regard the Tathagata as apart from form, as apart from feeling and perception, consciousness, and formations? So here is the third set of views. He's saying, do you regard the Tathagata, or as we understand the self, as apart from form, so independent of the 5 aggregates? This is a view of what would be known as basically Brahmanic, like the Brahman view, the Atman Brahman view. So basically the idea that the self is apart from any aspect of the body and its attributes. There is a Atma, there is a soul that is functioning outside of the parameters of the 5 aggregates, and they are controlling the 5 aggregates. And that can't be the case either, because the idea of a self then would be dependent upon, if they are apart or independent from the 5 aggregates, when the 5 aggregates are dissolved, what is left is this idea of the Atman. But the idea of the Atman is also based within thought. It's based within a concept that is rooted in the mind. The Atman cannot be, if there is an Atman, if there is a soul, it cannot be experienced through the mentality and materiality. And anything that is not able to be experienced through mentality, materiality, in that case, cannot be considered to be something that is true or valid, because within the Buddha's dispensation, everything that one experiences through conditions and causes happens through mentality and materiality. So the concept of a soul, the concept of a self outside of the 5 aggregates still exists within the mentality, still exists as an idea through which the mind experiences it. So it's still this conditional thought that is there. So then he says, what do you think, Anuradha? Do you regard form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness taken together as the Tathagata? No, Venerable Sir. So here he's saying then that sense of self could be made up of all the five aggregates together. So when you add up all the five aggregates, the sum of that is the self. But then that means the self is dependent upon these aggregates, which are already known to be impermanent. So if they fall apart, so does the self. But the idea of the permanent self does not exist on that basis. Then he says, what do you think, Anuradha? Do you regard the Tathagata as one who is without form, without feeling, without perception, without formations, without consciousness? No, venerable sir. So this is again back to that Atman Brahman idea, but now it's talking about the self not as only apart from the five aggregates, but without any of these five aggregates. So in the case of when the idea of the self was apart from these five aggregates, the self could still control these five aggregates as a soul, as an Atman. But if it is without the five aggregates, then it's considered to be Brahman. In this case, Brahman would refer to a cosmic oversoul. And again, the idea of that, the eternal consciousness, a consciousness that is all pervading, is still rooted within the concepts of the mind and can only be experienced through the processes of the mind. Because of that, it is still conditional, and because it is still conditional and conditioned, it cannot be considered to be an independent sense of self. It's just an idea. It's just an experience one can have, especially at the point of infinite space and infinite consciousness, but specifically at the point of infinite space where there is this all-pervasive sense of infinity, of, just no body, no nothing, but just this spaciousness. And a lot of times the experience of this Brahman is also experienced in that same way, but that's still within the conditioned reality, where once we understand this, we understand that even the jhanas, the first four jhanas, and in the ayatanas, the realms of infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothingness, and neither perception nor non-perception, all are conditioned. They arise because of a series of causes and conditions, and they are also impermanent. They are also not worth holding on to because they are impermanent, and they are also considered to be not self. So now we have these four sets of viewpoints. We have the first set of viewpoint that we understand now, that the self cannot be equated to any of the five aggregates. The self cannot be considered to be within any of the five aggregates. It cannot be considered to be apart from any of the five aggregates. It cannot be considered to be taken together as being created from the five aggregates together. And it can't be taken as being separate and something that is without the five aggregates. So after understanding, first and foremost, the impermanent nature of the five aggregates, just by understanding that alone, just not even looking at the other two marks of existence, you can apply this to those viewpoints and realize none of those viewpoints are valid when you test it against the understanding that the five aggregates are impermanent. So when you do it with all three characteristics, you realize that these viewpoints cannot hold. So then the Buddha says, but Anuradha, when the Tathagata is not apprehended by you as real and actual here in this very life, is it fitting for you to declare, friends, when a Tathagata is describing a Tathagata, the highest type of person, the supreme person, the attainer of the supreme attainment, he describes him apart from these four cases. The Tathagata exists after death, the Tathagata doesn't exist after death, the Tathagata both exists and doesn't exist after death, or the Tathagata neither exists nor does not exist after death. So basically he's saying, after having taken a look and understood all of these different viewpoints and understanding that they are invalid through the perspective of seeing the five aggregates as they really are, the idea of a self cannot be apprehended. The idea of a Tathagata cannot be apprehended. All it is a series of formations. So the idea of the Tathagata, the Buddha, talking and speaking and teaching, it's nothing more than just a series of formations and causes and conditions that create the wisdom, that create the understanding that is provided to the other monks and to other bhikkhus and so on. So what he's saying is, you cannot say that there is a Tathagata or there isn't a Tathagata. What you can say is there are causes and conditions in every moment that create the sense of self, that create the sense of a Tathagata, but you cannot apprehend it. You cannot capture it in just one moment because it's a series of flowing formations, causes, and conditions. So this is what Anuradha says, "No, Venerable Sir." So the Tathagata says, good, good, Anuradha. Formerly, Anuradha, and also now, I make known just suffering and the cessation of suffering. So what he's talking about is, if one were to ask the Buddha about the existence of a self or the non-existence of a self or the other two parts of the tetralemma or about the world or anything else, the Buddha is not concerned with that. He will not answer in those ways because they presuppose the concept of a self tied to something or another. But having seen dependent origination, having understood how dependent origination arises and creates the causes and conditions for this mentality materiality, for the experience of the five aggregates, and for the understanding of how the self is made up to create suffering, to cause suffering to this impermanent self, this sense of self. He is saying that that's all I discuss, that's all I teach, is this Dhamma of dependent origination. And it can all be encapsulated into the formula of the Four Noble Truths. Here he encapsulates it even further into two parts, suffering and the cessation of suffering. So what he's saying is, all I teach, as I was teaching before, is what is suffering, what are the causes of suffering, or how the suffering arises, what is the cessation of suffering, and how does one get to the cessation of suffering. That is it. That is the Four Noble Truths. So that's basically what the gist of this sutta is.
Thank you, Delson. Anyone question, please?
Thank you, Delson, for a very interesting read. I have a question about the view of the Atman. So is the argument against the Atman not so much whether one exists or not, but it's more like, if it sounded like you were saying, if I can think about this concept, then this concept is no good. So since I think about what an Atman is, then it means that whatever it is, it must be conditioned because I can think about it. And so then this is no good. And is that why perhaps they never describe Nibbana? They just say it's a thing, but we don't describe it, because then it would also fall under, it would also be susceptible to the same argument raised against the concept of an Atman. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, you know, Nibbana is also known as Nipapancha, which is essentially non-proliferation or non-conceptual mind. So even the non-conceptual mind is a concept. So that's why it is beyond the words, beyond the thoughts of a mind. Nibbana goes beyond the mind. And so it can be understood in the sense of quenching the fires of delusion, hatred, and greed, which is a good way of understanding what a mind without craving would be like. But the actual experience of Nibbana as such is beyond words, beyond concept.
Right, and so, but the concept of Atman falls within words and within concepts, I guess, and that's why it's rejected.
Yes, it's rejected for one reason is that, but secondly, the experience of the Atman, as people have experienced it or have described their experience, still falls into that whole conceptual mindset. So when you are, anything that you are experiencing in the way of mind is still a feeling and it's still a perception. And all feeling and perception is conditioned by the fact that it is happening within the mind and the body.
I see. So the Atman is more like an experience. It's not like the Christian idea of a soul.
Yeah. So in Vedanta, for example, there is the idea that the Atman is Brahman. So the Atman and the universe, the soul and the universe, are one and the same thing. So that's the other part of it, where it's this cosmic soul. But that too falls within the array of conditioned thought in the way of mentality, materiality. So if you were to talk about the experience of an Atman or experience of a Brahman, even their Vedas or even the teachings of Vedanta say you can't describe Atman outside of, everyday word. You can't describe it outside of concepts. It's just within the realm of concepts. That's why the Buddha didn't specifically say that there is an Atman or there isn't an Atman. But every time anybody proclaims that there is an Atman, they are saying it because they're saying it from their understanding through their mind, through the experience in the mind. So the soul, in that sense, I guess the Christian soul, the Christian concept of a soul is that it is eternal, and so that it exists beyond the dissolution of the body, which the Buddha is referring to here when they talk about the first viewpoint, which is of eternalism.
Mm-hmm.
You can't say that the soul is any of these five aggregates. So whenever he talks about the soul or the idea of a self, he's always relating it to the five aggregates, because this is really the totality of one's experience. It's a great way of summarizing the experience that one has in this world, whether it's related to the body, whether it's related to feeling in the sense of sensory experiences, mental experiences, whether it's related to perception, which is referring to memory and knowledge and learning and concepts, or whether it's formations, which are basically the impressions that one has in the mind based on previous choices one was taking. So behavioral patterns and things like that, and consciousness, which again, consciousness here referring to the awareness of something, the awareness of a sensory experience.
Thank you.
So, one question, please. Tathagata cannot be described after his death. It is only in the shape of cessation of suffering, but not even a feeling of cessation of feeling also not mentioned. Next. Coming to these words, particularly Dhamma, Kamma, Nibbana or Anapana, all these things, before Buddha was also there. When you mentioned about the Hindu literature, Upanishads and others, they were all quoting these words in a different way.
Yeah.
But Nibbana, what we say in our discourses is different from their Nibbana, Nirvana, for that matter.
Yeah.
How come these things, same words are differing in Hinduism and also actual Buddha Tripitaka, Suttavada?
Yeah.
Please explain.
Yeah. So the Upanishads, there's different understandings of when it was written. Some people say it was around the same time as the Buddha, but there are a few Upanishads like the Chandogya Upanishad and the Brihad Aranakya Upanishad.
Kaushataki.
Was written sometime before the Buddha. So
only five.
Yeah. In there, they describe the concept of the Atma. They describe the understanding of Brahman. They describe Om and all sorts of things that are related to Hinduism, and then that evolved into what we know as modern Vedanta. They do have a concept of nirvana. They call it Brahma, and sometimes they call it Brahma nirvana, or in the understanding there is that the different conditions of the mind and the body are totally let go of, and there is a fusion. There is this joining of Atma and Brahman. So they call it Brahma-leen also. One gets dissolved into Brahman, for example. So the Buddha, you just mentioned that the Buddha was there even before, but we have to understand that the Buddha in this case is the title for one who rediscovers the path in this way, who rediscovers the Four Noble Truths and who rediscovers the Eightfold Path. So there is one thing, according to this whole sort of complex matrix of Buddhism and the understanding of the suttas and everything else, there is one thing that seems to be always there, but the difference is it's not known of until a Buddha is there to explain it. And that is the process of dependent origination. So it's not that when the Buddha arose, that was the only time dependent origination was there. A Pacceka Buddha would also find the same thing, the understanding of dependent origination. Although they wouldn't be out there discussing it, they would just have the understanding for themselves. The Samasama Buddha, which is the Buddha as we know him, Gautama, and the other Buddhas before him, just rediscovered the same thing, the same information, which is understanding how dependent origination works. So the understanding of dependent origination is definitely different from how cognition is understood in the Upanishads. For example, in the Upanishads, there is the understanding of the Atman as the central force, and it's like a charioteer, and it's controlling the five horses, which are the senses. But here in Buddhism, there's no central force, there's no central idea of a controller. The way Buddha understood how the mechanics of cognition worked was that it just arose because of contact with the six sense bases. And so he understood that once you understand this, you let go of your attachments to anything considered to be self, because he understood that these different five aggregates are not considered to be self. In the Upanishads also, they say the body is not self. They have the concept of neti, which is the body is not self, the mind is not self, the organs aren't self, the senses are not self, and so on and so forth. But they still come to this understanding that there is still some kind of eternal self, which is known as, for example, Satchidananda, which is this existence, consciousness, and bliss. And they describe it in different ways, but essentially it all is referring to this idea of Brahman. It is the substratum of existence. It is this idea that from that Brahman, all things then arise. But the Buddha never professed that. What he said was, things arise because of causes and conditions. So the Nibbana that we experience, or that is experienced, the Nibbana that is the unconditioned, goes beyond the conditioned reality. It is something that is outside, so to speak, of conditioned reality. The experience itself is the seeing of the links of dependent origination, letting go of the fetters, letting go of the conditions, and coming to that state of the unconditioned. And so to describe it, you would have to describe it within conditioned reality. You would have to describe it within concepts and words. So the difficulty lies therein, trying to bring what is unconditioned into a conditioned reality, trying to bring it out. But the best way to understand Nibbana, and there are a lot of different ways Nibbana is described as best as possible, in a lot of like poetic ways and a lot of different descriptions. But the best, most foundational understanding of Nibbana is the quenching of the fires of greed, of hatred and delusion, which means one has completely let go of craving. One has completely let go of aversion and let go of identification. So that's why for the Buddha, he was not concerned about the idea of the Atma or the Brahman. He was more concerned about suffering, mental suffering. His whole path, when he went forth, was to find out, why do people suffer? How do they suffer? And how can one relieve oneself, so to speak, from suffering? So that's how he came to his understanding of reality, which is the Four Noble Truths.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Sorry to just jump back in here, just to follow up on the question. So because the Buddha is concerned with suffering and ending suffering, worrying about, is there a self, is there no self, is there an Atman, is there no Atman, is there a ghost in the machine, is there a soul? Even if I got an answer to those questions, that's not going to end my suffering.
Exactly.
So they're almost irrelevant to ending suffering. Is that a way of understanding?
Yes, that's a very good way of saying it, because that's essentially why he didn't respond to these kind of questions, because it was not a means to be able to experience the end of suffering. Somebody has their hand raised. It looks like.
Hi. Hello. Thank you, Delson. I was wondering why, can you see me? I have a kind of unstable connection. I'm sorry, I have my camera on, but can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I was wondering why we couldn't just say, I don't know. I don't know. What would be a problem with that answer? I don't know if there is a self or not a self, and or even with the argument of saying, yes, you know, everything is in a flux and in a flow, and the whole discourse on, you know, whether there is or is not a self. What is the problem with the answer? This I that thinks it is a self doesn't know, because that's essentially what I understand. This I that has this concept of a self really does not know, and this I is what's trying to articulate, and it doesn't know. So this I that's articulating is saying, trying to tell this other I there's no self. It doesn't know. The other I doesn't know. Nobody knows. So saying I don't know seems like that would be quite appropriate.
Yeah, it would seem like it's quite appropriate, but in fact, the Buddha had also talked about this in reference to being some of the questions related to being the unanswerable questions. For the mere fact that, yes, one can say, I don't know, but then that idea of I don't know, it also lies in the territory of there is a self that doesn't know if there is a self. So he tried to answer in a way to say that, okay, yes, there is a self, but that self is conditioned. That idea of a self is conditioned. So there is a self in every moment through the process of dependent origination. So he was answering it from that context, that even if one was to say, I don't know, that I that doesn't know, still there is an arising of that I, whether one knows it or doesn't know. So his understanding was that I that arises comes through this process of mentality materiality, comes through the mind and the factors of the mind, comes through the form and the consciousness that is rooted to this form, to this body. The processes that arise through contact and feeling create this idea of a self. And from that idea of a self arises the craving, because once you have the concept of a self, it causes you to personalize things. It causes the mind to relate everything through that concept of conceit, this concept of I am. And as soon as that happens, the craving arises, because now if something good was to happen, there is this identification. Once you personalize it and identify with it, then all your actions are conditioned by that. So the Buddha is just trying to point out that. He doesn't want you to figure out if there's a self or not a self, but he wants you to figure out, yes, there is suffering through conditions. Find out what those conditions are and let them go, and then experience the cessation of suffering.
And so it sounds like that the reason he wants to teach that is because if I think that there's a self that's trying to, that can be released from suffering. In other words, the self accomplishes this understanding of being, this I understands the concept of the dependent origination, and then it has a sort of feeling that it's figured it out. There's an I that's figured it out, in other words. So if one said they didn't know, then they'd be open to saying, oh, the I conquered this idea of no self. And yeah, I think I understand. Does that make sense? Am I understanding you right?
It makes sense. And I would want to bring it to the context of the understanding of the 4 levels of awakening in that case. Because when you talk about the 4 levels of awakening, we're talking about the stream enterer, we're talking about the Sotapanna, we're talking about the Sakadagami, the once returner, the Anagami, the non-returner, and the Arahant, the one who has basically perfected this whole path. So when it comes to the stream enterer, what happens in the case of a stream enterer is they understand through the process of infinite consciousness. When you are in infinite consciousness, you start to see the flickering of consciousness. So you see that there are these conditions arising and passing away. So because of that, you start to let go of this idea of a self. You're no longer concerned about the idea of a self. You're no longer worried, or your mind is deluded by notions of self or not self or anything. It just lets go of the concepts of self. But there is still an inherent sense of self still there. This is called conceit. It's called mana in Pali. And this conceit continues on till the Sakadagami and till the Anagami. That's why if one has experienced cessation and one experiences that nibbana and then the post-cessation experience of the relief, that relief itself feels so good. There is a self attached to it. There is this I, that I feel this relief and I feel amazing and I really like this and I enjoy this. Immediately now there's a sense of self there. So this self-accomplishment also is there until the point where one realizes even this idea of attaching the self to this relief doesn't make sense, because that relief came about because of contact with the Nibbana element. And if you continue to take that as self, there's still a conceit there. If you let go of even that and see that as arising because of causes and conditions, then you have weakened the fetter of conceit and completely let that go. And now anything that you understand through the mind, your experience with the world, is seen as just impersonal causes and conditions. So there is another sutta called Kema Sutta, Kema Sutta or Kemaka Sutta. And we might discuss that another time. But in that sutta, you have the old monk Kemaka, who's quite weak and ill, and he's staying somewhere else. And these group of monks are asking Kemaka if he has attained arahatship, and he says he hasn't, even though he understands that the 5 aggregates are not self, even though he understands that the 5 aggregates are impersonal, because he said he still has the sense of I am within the 5 aggregates. So as he explains it, he then for himself and then the other people listening realize what he's talking about as the 5 aggregates being arisen because of causes and conditions. And so why take what is just a series of causes and conditions as me, mine, myself, and just see it for what it is? In that seeing, even that perception is impersonal. So it's really like the Matrix. You're just seeing all the codes of reality arising, which are the causes and conditions, but you're not referring it in the sense of self. You're not referring it as a self or outside of self or anything like that. And because of that, they attain arahatship.
Thank you.
I would like to ask you one question, one more.
Yeah.
So, despite knowing all this from Buddha, the latest saints like Ramana and others, Ramana Maharshi and others, they did not spell out properly as like how you are explaining in the same way. And for the last 2000, 3000, 2500 years, people have not come out with a proper way of writing the books, including Yoga Vasistha. It speaks about that self only. Finally, it will not conclude properly like this. This is the fallacy in our literature. That's what I feel, ancient literature. Could you please explain anything about it?
Yeah.
It's out of the syllabus.
You know, in reference to Ramana Maharishi, he discussed the idea of this I thought. He said, if you look at the thought of the I and you go behind that, then you will experience just the self. So he still had that concept of this pure consciousness, this pure idea of consciousness being self. In the Yoga Vishishta, you know, they try to bring in Buddhist ideas. They try to bring in the ideas of understanding things as self and not self. But in the very end, even there, Rama, when he listens to Vashishta, concludes that all there is I am. So there is actually a greater sense of I am, that I am that, I am, you know, the whole universe is me and all of that. But all that whole experience that you have of I am is still within the conditions of the mind. So when you go to the Brahmajala Sutta, the different kinds of views that the Buddha talks about, he says the idea of a consciousness that is eternal can only be experienced through mind. And if anything that is experienced through mind is conditioned, which means that it is subject to change. So if you talk about the sense of self, the sense of an eternal consciousness, you're saying that it's always there. But is it actually always there? Because you're only experiencing it there for that time of being, for that time of experience. When your attention goes away from it, is it still there or is it not there? You go back to it and it's a different experience. So it's not an all-pervasive experience. It's just that experience of consciousness tied to that experience. So it's like an iota, it's just fragmentary, but it looks like it's flowing. And so it feels like it's all pervasive.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Delson, I have a small question.
Yeah.
About when we are doing the meditation, we realize, okay, feelings come, it's disappeared, and perceptions come, it's disappeared. Like that, when you are understanding the process, when you are investigation, the awareness is watching all these things. And Nibbana means awareness also vanished. In that itself, even though in the process we didn't identify the non-self, if the awareness goes away, the full there is no self recognitions happening now, something like that.
Yeah. So you're talking about the awareness that you see when you're watching how these things arise. That awareness is tied to that experience. So the experience that you have, whatever it might be, in your mind or just now, you're experiencing it through one or more of the six sense bases, which includes the mind. So when you're meditating, you have these different experiences that you're having, but each experience is like a frame in a movie. And each frame is a frame of consciousness that you're experiencing. And because it's so fluid, it all looks like it's just one thing. But actually, in a microsecond, you have millions of different frames of this understanding consciousness. Now, when you have the cessation of perception and feeling, that is the Nirodha Samapati one experiences, the Nirodha one experiences, letting go of all formations. There is no experience at all. You can't say there is an experience or there is no experience, in the sense that there's nobody there to experience that cessation. You only know it after you come out of it. Like you only
there is no consciousness.
There is no consciousness there.
In the no feelings, no perceptions, there is no consciousness.
There's no consciousness there either. Yeah.
That stage.
Yeah.
That means there is no person to watch that. There itself, we can recognize the non-self.
You dropped off for a little bit. Can you repeat what you said?
Yeah, that then there itself we can recognize the non-self.
You can recognize the not self
If there is no feelings and perception.
Yeah, so when you have the cessation of perception, feeling, and consciousness, there's absolutely no idea that there was a cessation at all, except after you come out of it. So when I say when you come out of it, what I'm saying is, what happens is the formations arise. The formations rise and they're completely pure. It has made contact with the nirvana element. So what is being seen, because the mind is so sharp, the mindfulness has become so clear, is seeing how the concept of self arises. The idea of self being created, so long as there is this personalizing going on. But if no personalizing is going on, then all you're seeing is just this series of conditions that create the concept of cognition, that create the experience of cognition, that create the experience of consciousness. So the not self, the understanding of not self is solidified when you see that there's no involvement of a you in the flowing of the in the post-cessation event.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Hi, Delson. Yeah, I have a similar question. I want to know if we are like in the process of the meditation practice is trying to, this is the concept of, as far as I have been trying to tap in and understand what the sutta and all many sutta about like the non-I, right, is to get to a concept or a non-concept of like, and the practice also like to get rid of a concept. So is something is, can I my own interpretation, I just would like your advice and guide to this thought, whether it's correct, is the neither nor, like it's neither nor. Is everything is neither nor. There is nothing, even the concept is neither nor. So everything we are experiencing is neither nor. Can I be interpreting it like this way? Or is like, and also how do we understand to use the sitting to get to a mindset level of such? Can you give me a little bit of
yeah, can you give me more clarity when you say neither nor? Are you referring to neither nor, meaning that neither there is a self or not a self?
Neither nor of anything that has been experienced, even though the experience itself is also like is. First, we have to understand that neither nor of a self, right? That is the concept, but we're trying, is a conceptual thinking here also, that we are trying to get to the level in the sitting and in the practice that this concept of having a neither, having a concept is not there, like it's neither like this nor like that. So this neither nor has been always like swinging in my head. So that's why I've been trying to understand. And that is also what we want to try to get our mindset to such things when we are experiencing the world, like with all these sufferings. I mean, all this uncontrollable like concept, like a perception, cognition, consciousness, that all happens, that we have sometimes get on fire, like that that on fire of those five aggregates is have to be understood as neither nor. This is what I was trying to get myself to understand, how to get the cease of suffering. Am I on the right thought, or is it something I imagine? I don't know. Please help. Yeah.
When you refer to the five aggregates, it's not that they exist or don't exist, because in that moment they do exist, but then they are gone. They arise and they pass away. So you have to understand it from that perspective. So when the five aggregates arise, that's the understanding that feeling has arisen, for example. That feeling arose because there was contact with the outside world, with the sense objects and the sense receptors. There was contact between the two, and there was feeling. So, for example, the light hits my eye, or the light hits the eye receptors, the photoreceptors in the eye, and feeling of seeing. But then another ray of light hits, and it's happening in every microsecond. So you have to look at it from the perspective of arising and passing away. So in the arising, there is that sense of this feeling there, the feeling being present, but it goes away when it passes away, but there is another feeling. So it's everything that arises and passes away does so because of a series of causes and conditions. So neither nor, you can't really apply it to neither feeling nor not feeling. So there is a feeling or not a feeling. There is a feeling in that moment of the arising, and then it passes away, and there is a new feeling in the new moment, and there's a passing away. Likewise with perception, formations, and consciousness.
So the point is just to understand that is the process, but it's not like we have to it's not a alienation from it. This is what maybe I was always like seeing, maybe trying an alienation, which is not right, which is just to understand it, to be a ongoing, like a recurring of whatever that is the five aggregates in action, but there is not an identification in it. It is that understanding is not a concept, but it's an understanding there. So our practice, I'm trying to get this into tied up with our practice. So the practice is to trying to get to a state of the mind that we are able to see that happening. Is that correct?
Yes, you want to be able to see it, but the thing is, in trying to do it, in trying to make a conscious effort to see it, you're strengthening that sense of self. So in trying to investigate into it, who is the investigator in this case? That is investigating into the nature of self and the nature of reality. So it's not about I am investigating. It's not about, I am being mindful of it. It's just that this perception arises, that the experience of not self arises. So there is another sutta in which Sariputta is talking, Ananda actually asks him, he says, is there a understanding, or is there a level of perception, or is there a level of awareness that goes beyond the understanding of the four elements, that goes beyond the understanding of the planes of existence, that goes beyond the understanding of the four jhanas and the arupa jhanas, and goes beyond all concepts? And he said, yes, there is. And it is this nibbana he's experiencing, the nibbana through the experience of perceiving what he calls bhava nirodha. So anything that you're perceiving, you're seeing as the cessation of the causes and conditions for suffering. But in trying to look for it, it's going to only strengthen the sense of self. The reason why the meditation is happening, or one does the meditation, is to come to a collected mind. And the investigative factor, the investigation into it, is just this perception of it. It's like this. You have feeling and you have perception. Feeling is the bare sensation of what is arising, or the bare understanding of the mental experience as the experience. Perception is knowing that that experience is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. In the same way, the mindfulness is your attention on the experience, just the awareness that that experience is there. The investigation is knowing what kind of experience that is. So if you're investigating insofar as knowing what kind of state of mind the mind is in. But going beyond that would be reflection and analysis. And that going beyond into reflection and analysis creates mental proliferation. So the trying to look for the understanding of self and not self is going to be counterintuitive. Rather, you make the mind collective through the process of jhana and allow things to arise as they arise and watch them without identifying with them. So this process of trying not to identify with it, that also can create the sense of self that's trying to disidentify with it. So it's just seeing clearly the arising and passing away without any involvement in there. That's why when you come to that deepest level where you have cessation of perception and feeling and consciousness, and the formations arise again and create this cognition through this process of dependent origination, you're just seeing it clearly. There is this mindfulness, this perceiving that is undirected, that is without any sign, which is signless. So this is the contact that they talk about post-cessation. It is the signless contact. It doesn't hold on to any object with any sense of self. It is undirected. It doesn't direct its attention anywhere. It's just watching, just looking. And it's empty, it's void. It's void of any personalizing of that process. So the further you deepen your mind to be able to just see clearly as things arise without involving it, without involving a sense of self, the more clearly you'll be able to see, the more clearly you'll be able to see how this process arises and passes away.
Thank you very much. Yes, yeah, it's the watching, the keeping like the level of the distance of layer and layer of seeing how it happens. Well, thank you very much. It's furthering the understanding and help. Thank you. It helps a lot. Thank you, Delson, for all your guide all the time.
Delson, after hearing you, I've got one more question.
Yeah.
People from the Arupa realms, how they get the formations after completing their life, rebirth, after completing their life in that Arupa realm, and the dense bodies, how they get the formations and the dense bodies, they are not supposed to get.
No, there will still be formations there. See, the formations are not rooted in the physicality of the body. The formations, see, they can be likened to be like synapses. So in the same way, your brain has different synapses that keep coming and going and keep changing neuroplasticity. It's a metaphor for formations, but formations can be understood as carriers of karma. They're carriers of experience. So there are thoughts, there are feelings, there are perceptions that can still arise in the process of the Arupa jhanas. In what way? In perceiving that Arupa jhana. So there's formations that arise based on the experience of infinite space. There's formations that arise based on the understanding of infinite consciousness. Because there are those formations, you can access those Arupa jhanas from the beginning. So what happens is when you have contact with the Arupa jhana experiences, it creates those formations. Those formations having been arisen will still remain in some way, but they will keep arising and passing away. They're not just stored somewhere. They arise based on the conditions. So for example, once you have gone beyond the fourth jhana and you have experienced infinite space, you finish your practice and then you do something else. And then you continue your meditation later, and now you start from infinite space. How were you able to continue with infinite space? Because you are perceiving that through your meditation. That perception of infinite space is rooted in the formations, which are the memory of that infinite space. So in the same way, when you talk about people in the arupa realms, let's say outside on the macro level, there are still formations there based on their experience of the arupa jhanas in a previous life.
I want to say this way. Because mindfulness is there for a living being, it is coming back, and after the experience of in meditation, it is coming back to their body. In the case of arupa realms, the mind is preparing some material. That is why they are getting bodies. Is it correct?
They don't have materiality, but they have mentality.
Mentality. Mentality is preparing material.
Within the arupa realm?
Yes, they have the kamma seeds. Because they have the kamma seeds, the mind is preparing the material. We have to come to that conclusion because of your answer. Something it is there.
There is an experience going on, but the mentality is not rooted in any kind of materiality as we would understand it. So the understanding of the arupa realms is that it's formless, which means there is no actual materiality there, but there is still some mental factors present.
Yes.
Mental factors, it's like this. It's like, you know, you have the concept of the mind-made body within the understanding of even the suttas or even outside the suttas, where one can do astral projection and things like that. So that experience is happening through the mentality. Now, yes, you can say that the mentality is within the materiality in the human realm and in the realms where there is still a physicality. But this understanding is there that the mentality is without the materiality. So there is still this idea of mentality that isn't rooted or dependent upon the materiality. So how they experience reality is not through the six sense bases, but it's just through the factors of mentality in some way or another. It's like how you're able to, in your own mind right now, if I tell you to think about a lion, the image of a lion pops up, but it's not dependent upon your materiality. It's dependent upon your ability to imagine that lion, which is in the mind itself.
Thank you. Correct answer.
Hi, Delson.
Okay.
So I have a question that I think is kind of in a way, a follow-up to this last question. You know, I always have this question when there's, you know, discussions of not self. Well, like, what is it that's accumulating karma? What is it that's reborn? You know, what is it that's sort of continuing on? Is it formations that we're talking about here, or could you maybe clarify that a little bit, please?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Sure. So there is this understanding of intention, which is one of the factors of mind, where you have an intention to do something, volition to do something. So that intention is within the nama rupa, the mentality, materiality. Mentality is made up of contact, feeling, perception, intention, attention. These are the factors of mentality, the faculties. Now, there's a sutta in which the Buddha talks about the different states of existence and how they arise. And he talks about how if intention was fettered by craving and hindered by ignorance, that intention drives forward a new consciousness that takes rebirth in that new state of existence. And he calls kama the field, consciousness as the seed, and craving as the moisture. So let's say we talk about rebirth between lifetimes. So at the dissolution of one body and before the rising of another body, in that mind of that being, there are certain things going on that are karmic impressions. Maybe they're thinking about things that happened in that life. Maybe they have remorse, or they have great joy arising, or whatever it is. Whatever that emotion is, it is fettered by conceit. It is fettered by this personal sense of self, and that craves for that experience to continue. It wants that experience to continue, and because it wants that experience to continue, that craving attaches with that intention a new consciousness to the formations. Those formations are creating that sense of remorse or that sense of joy that it wants to experience. It drives out that consciousness from this life. And when that consciousness that is called the evolving consciousness, it gets rooted in a new mentality materiality, let's take for simplicity's sake, a new human rebirth. That consciousness then is implanted in a new mentality materiality at the point of conception. And then a new consciousness arises, so that those formations have now taken root in that new mentality materiality, and they continue on. But there is a caveat that the Buddha has, which are essentially his final words before parinibbana, which is all sankharas are impermanent. So for anyone who thinks that sankharas are permanent, he explains that even these sankharas are dependent upon different experiences, dependent upon contact and so on. So even though we say these formations have now taken root in a new mentality materiality, they are still impermanent because they arise based on conditions of contact and they pass away. So ultimately, it's not about the dissolution of formations that causes parinibbana. It's the non-attachment to those formations. It's the non-craving. Because the mind of the Arhat is destroyed craving altogether, there is no moisture for any more kama to take place. There's no moisture for the seed of consciousness to be nutrified within that field of kama. And so because no craving is nutrifying it, not sticking to those formations, there is no new consciousness that is arising to take rebirth in a new mentality materiality.
All right, thank you.
Delson, I have a question. When you are in Arupa Jhana, even though your mind doesn't go anywhere, can you hear the sounds?
Can you hear the sound in Arupa Jhana?
Yeah.
You can hear a distant sound. Sometimes there is sensory impact. Now, the traditional understanding is at the fourth jhana, there is no more sensory impact.
Mm-hmm.
But even in infinite consciousness, you might still hear something in the distance, for example. But it won't be as prominent as it would have been in a preceding jhana.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't hear it at all, it could be because the mind has become too absorbed. Because you still want to have an open awareness of all things. Even the Arupa jhanas, even though there is no formation, there is no form, there's no rupa in the Arupa jhanas, there's still mentality going on, which means there's still feeling and perception still going on, even though that feeling and perception can be internal. So they can, because that you can still experience things within the mind, and you can still experience any distant sounds that are arising.
Okay, only the sound, because formation is not there. You don't feel the bodily sensations. No. Only the sounds. Yeah. Thank you.
So any of
yeah, you can explain further.
No, any of the experiences of the five physical senses become quite weak. So they might be there, but it's very, very almost imperceptible. This is what I'm referring to. It can be experienced, but the mind is so away from the concepts of sense, so away from the concepts of the body, that it doesn't really pay attention to anything that is related to the sensory experiences. So the sensory impact is still there, but the mind is no longer paying attention to it. If you put your attention there, you can hear it. But because your attention is not there, you're not really paying attention to that sound, even though it's existing.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Any more questions? I think Delson been talking about 1.5 hours now. Maybe thank you so much again, and then we were going to do a sitting for half an hour.
Thank you, Delson, so much. Really appreciate it. Very
Thank you.
grateful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Delson.
Delson, thank you.
Take care.
Delson, thank you.
Thank you, Delson.